And the reason we actually lived there was that I had chosen just a few months prior not to buy Terrell Owens' house. Over the weekend, one of my college roommates got married, and we were all together catching up and telling stories, and I was reminded of a car story that I hadn't told here yet, and it's probably about the cheapest car that I've ever discussed, which, in the company of the $1,500 S55 and the Brock Yates Audi, is quite an accolade. But fortunately, the Audi should have an update in the next few weeks. It's been running quite well, but it's developed the habit of shredding shift bushings about every 20 miles or so, and that's a story for another day. But the car in question is actually an early 90s burgundy Saturn, and it was parked right next to a house that we lived in West Midtown while we were going to Georgia Tech. And 25 years prior to that, when my parents were going to Georgia Tech, West Midtown was a place where you went to get stabbed. And at the time we lived there, it was on the tipping point of gentrification, so it was a place where you would go and only occasionally get stabbed. Certainly not a place where you'd go meet your neighbors, but it was a very inexpensive place to live. And the reason we actually lived there was that I had chosen just a few months prior not to buy Terrell Owens' house. This again was in 2006. It was just after I had started the rental car company, and you could get debt for anything. I mean, stated income loans, 80-10-10 mortgages where you didn't put anything down. And at the time, renting a house was like lighting a cheap cigar with a flaming $100 bill. I mean, it was the most financially reckless thing you could ever be accused of doing. So everybody was trying to buy real estate and things like that. And so we were like, maybe we should buy a house. So we were talking to a real estate agent who obviously was all in favor of it. And one of the houses that he had found for us was at the time owned by Terrell Owens. And so we had gone out to tour it, and it was an amazing place because I was really looking for a place not only where a bunch of us could live, but that I could store all my cars to save that money. And he had an indoor basketball court. And as much as I love the game of basketball, having it as kind of an indoor parking garage showroom for a bunch of exotic cars sounded great to me. I mean, if it worked for Tiffany Amber Thiessen and Peter Facinelli in Fastlane, it needed to work for me. And it also had a great gym that was strangely decorated with a lot of different ways to calculate the number 81, obviously his jersey number, but they were not the most complex ways to arrive at the number 81. I think it was like 80 plus 1 or 85 minus 4. Maybe the most complex was the square root of 81 squared. And it was a fascinating place. It had a lot of bedrooms, most of which were decorated with the names of his children, all of which had slight variations of the name Terrell Owens, like Terrella Owens or Terrell O. Owens or Terrellique Owens, and it was awesome. I mean, there was this huge pool that was like a sand thing it was on a lake, and it had a pretty big garage in which were his orange Beetle convertible and a Vesuvius orange 2006 Range Rover Sport Supercharged, which was the hottest thing on earth at the time. Doug Tabbitt was out flipping them, going out west for 50 grand over sticker. I mean, they were huge. And in the foyer, there was this gigantic bronze bust of himself, and all the decorations were pretty much blown up magazine covers that he had been on. So a very, very cool place to tour, but it was about 20 minutes outside of town, and I think it was $1.3 million, and the agent was confident like 950 might do it. You know, what a deal. But I ended up deciding, and fortunately avoiding the subsequent bankruptcy bullet, to not buy this house. And so we ended up moving into this duplex in West Midtown, and each half of the duplex had 6 bedrooms, 6 bathrooms, and 2 kitchens. And behind it, there was this parking area that had enough space for, a bunch of cars. And it was certainly not a place where I was going to park Ferraris and Lamborghinis, but it was ample. But unfortunately, the most desirable spot, the closest one to our house, was filled with this early 90s burgundy Saturn with dent-resistant panels and a bunch of flat tires and tree sap all over it, just utterly disgusting. And apparently it had just been abandoned there. So not long after we moved in, I called the landlord and said, hey, can you get this abandoned car towed? The Saturn's in the way of everything, and we'd really like it out of here. And he said, yeah, let me look into it, and didn't do anything. So every couple of weeks I'd call him and give him names of junk car companies and towing services and things like that, but he would never do it. And this guy owned a bunch of rental property, and in fact, he had bought this one as we were closing on our lease from some Russian guy that we had arranged the lease with. So he was kind of new to all this, and I know he had a lot more problems to deal with than getting a Saturn towed. But it was an eyesore and an annoyance to us. And when we got back from Christmas break in January of 2007, the car had been vandalized. The windshield and some of the glass had been broken in. And so I called the landlord and said, hey, look, the car got vandalized. It needs to get out of here. At the very least now, it sets the precedent that the cars in this area can be vandalized. So this is going to lead to some problems. Please get the car towed. But about a week later, rather than getting the car towed, he shows up at our door and asks to talk to us all Spanish Inquisition style about who beat up the car. And I hadn't done it. We didn't know who had done it. So we all sit down, and I generally assume the role of chief negotiator in this group of friends. And so I'm explaining to him like how ridiculous it is that he's asking us this stuff. The abandoned car needs to be towed. It's needed to be towed 6 months ago. And he keeps asking us all these prying questions. And I was told later that I could never have sounded any more guilty of having destroyed this car because I was just so elated that someone had actually done it, and it might prod this guy into actually getting the car out of there. So nothing really happened, and he kind of left annoyed, and we continued to be annoyed. And over the next couple of weeks, the car did not get towed. It did not leave. We kept asking him, kept calling him, and he just completely ignored the issue. So over time, it just kind of became the punching bag of the community. I mean, if we wanted to hit something or scratch something or put something somewhere, we would just beat up the car. And it just got more and more destroyed, more and more beat up, but I mean, it wasn't going anywhere. The car was worth $400 as scrap and $200 as a car. So its eventual fate was obviously going to be junk car removal. And despite our continued request for that to happen, he would just keep saying, I'm going to get around to it, and never would. So we left for spring break, and while I was gone, I got a call from one of my roommates, and he said, Ed, you will never guess what happened last night. I said, I love a story. Tell me. He said, well, in the middle of the night, this guy starts banging on our door, and he says, I have a gun. I'm going to kill you all. You destroyed my car. Apparently, he'd been quite fond of this Saturn. And we were a household of limited means and limited personal protection, so the only thing they had to fight back if he were to get through this plastic door was our intramural softball bat and some steak knives. So they'd called the police and were hoping that before he made it through, the cops would arrive. And they were pretty slow in that area, so they needed to be ready. And so there was 2 guys there on our side, and this guy screaming. And he figured out somehow that he was not easily able to kick in the door, so he decided he was going to try to come in through the window. So he picked up our grill, the only thing the local vagrants hadn't stolen and taken to the local pawn shop, and tried to throw it through the window. And he got it at least into the window and broke the first floor window that was near my bedroom. And he tried to crawl through, but only managed to cut himself up terribly. So he's outside in the rain, bleeding. And he decided the best way for him to get us back at that point was to bleed all over all the cars that were in the parking lot. So part of this call was to say, Ed, you're going to have Megan, my then girlfriend, now wife's car cleaned. And her 2000 white over tan automatic V6 convertible Ford Mustang was parked in our parking area for that spring break, and he had bled all over it and every other car. And the cops had arrived just as he had kind of collapsed, either from the bleeding or his heart exploded or something, because they later told us that the reason he was going quite so crazy was actually the PCP. And so a few days later, when we heard from the landlord telling him, hey dude, you got to get this car out of here, please, he said, well, that PCP-Crazed lunatic was actually living in the other side of the duplex. And I don't know how he had not been able to discover, in hopefully investigating the whereabouts of the owner of this Saturn, that he lived in his rental property. But he had obviously decided to evict him from the house, and finally he did get the car towed away, and he paid to buy us a new grill and have our window repaired. But obviously a lot of the times we talk about all the great ways that cars can bring people together, but sometimes when the person on the other side of the equation is a PCP-crazed lunatic, they can actually be quite a divisive force.